I went into Blackhollow Forest looking for 3 missing people. Instead, I found something standing outside my tent. And the next day, I interviewed it. I'm not a storyteller, I'm not an actor. I'm a documentary filmmaker, 12 years of it. I deal in facts, in footage, in things that can be verified. I filmed wildfires. I filmed floods. I filmed the aftermath of things that destroy lives. And I always came home. I always came home. Until the week something that was never supposed to answer back. Answer. What you're about to hear is everything I remember. Not everything I filmed. Because some of what I filmed doesn't exist anymore. If you're watching this at night, alone, in a quiet house, I'd turn a light on. Not because it will help, but because you'll want to see the room around you when this is over. Let's begin from the beginning, with why I went in. It started with a phone call. A producer I'd worked with twice before, a woman named Dana, called me on a Tuesday morning and asked if I'd ever heard of a place called Blackhollow Forest. I hadn't. She told me 3 people had vanished there over the past 14 months. Not lost, not presumed drowned in the river, vanished. The first was a 44-year-old hunter named Russell Voss. Experience. Had hunted that forest for over 20 years. He walked in on the second morning of a solo trip and never walked out. Search and rescue found his truck at the trailhead. His rifle still in the case, untouched. His boots were found 4 miles in, standing upright, side by side. Laces tied, like he had simply stepped out of them. No footprints leading away from the boots, none leading back. The second was a 19-year-old college student named Amy Castellano, who went in with 2 friends to shoot photos for a class project. She wandered ahead of the group to get a better angle of the tree line. Her friends said she was gone less than 90 seconds. They called her name for 6 hours. Her camera was never found. Neither was she. The third was a retired forest ranger named Elias Cho, a man who had worked that exact land for 31 years before retiring. He went back in alone, deliberately, according to a note he left his daughter, and wrote 4 words before he left. I have to check. He never explained what he meant by that. He never came back either. Local police ruled all 3 cases unresolved. No evidence of foul play, no blood, no struggle, no signs of an animal attack. The kind of case that looks less like a crime and more like the forest simply closed over them, the way water closes over a stone. But there was one detail buried in the case files that the official reports never connected, and that Dana almost didn't mention to me at all because it sounded, in her words, too strange to put in a documentary. Russell Voss's hunting partner, the man who was supposed to join him but canceled at the last minute, told police that Russell had called him the night before he vanished, rattled, saying he'd heard his late wife's voice out past the ridge, calling his name clear as day. His wife had been dead 6 years. Amy Castellano's friends said that in the seconds before she wandered off to get her photo angle, she'd gone quiet, tilted her head like she was listening to something, and murmured, "Did you hear that?" That sounded like my mom. Her mother was 2 states away at the time. and Elias Cho's daughter, the one who received his 4-word note, said her father had called her the week before he went back in, asking, almost embarrassed, whether she remembered a specific nickname he used to call her as a little girl. A nickname, he said, he'd heard someone use for him from somewhere deep in the trees. On his last routine patrol before retirement, he hadn't heard that nickname spoken back to him in over 20 years. 3 people. 3 voices that shouldn't have existed. 3 people who followed them anyway. I filed it away as a strange coincidence. The kind of detail that makes for a good documentary beat but doesn't mean anything on its own. I was wrong about that too. Aina wanted a documentary. 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Missing persons, small town mystery, that kind of thing. I'd done a dozen like it. I said yes before I'd even looked at a map. I wish, more than almost anything else in my life, that I hadn't. Blackhollow Forest sits at the edge of a national reserve. Technically protected land, though almost nobody enforces that this far out. The nearest town, Millbrook Junction, has 1 gas station, 1 diner, and a population that, according to the sign, hasn't changed in 11 years. The waitress at the diner didn't want to talk about the forest. The gas station clerk didn't want to talk about the forest. An old man sitting outside the hardware store, whittling something out of a piece of pine, was the only person who would. He didn't look up when I approached with my camera. "You going in there?" he asked, before I'd said a word. I told him I was. He nodded slowly, like he'd already known the answer before he asked. "3 that we know of," he said. "There's more that we don't." I asked him what he meant. He set down his knife. "Forest's old," he said. "Older than the town. Older than the roads. People used to know not to go and past the second ridge. Not because of animals." He looked up at me for the first time. "Because of what answers when you call something by its name." I asked him what he meant by call something by its name. He picked his knife back up. "You'll figure it out," he said. "Where you won't come back to tell anybody you didn't." I thought it was local color. The kind of spooky quote that makes good B-roll for a documentary. I even remember smiling as I thanked him. I didn't understand yet. I loaded my gear. 2 cameras, a drone, 3 days of supplies, a satellite phone. And I drove to the trailhead alone. My sound guy had backed out 2 days earlier, food poisoning. And rather than delay the shoot, I decided to go one solo for the first 2 nights and bring a small crew and fill wide shots later. That decision saved my crew's lives. I didn't know that yet either. The hiking took most of the afternoon. Blackhollow doesn't look unusual at first. Tall pine, dense undergrowth, the occasional deer trail. I filmed establishing shots. I filmed the spot where Russell Voss's boots were found. Arc now with a small weathered cross someone had planted years ago. I filmed the tree line where Amy Castellano vanished in under 90 seconds. By the time I set up camp, the light was already dying. I want to be precise about what happened that night, because precision is the only thing I have left that feels solid. At 9:40 p.m., according to the timestamp on my camera, I heard something outside my tent. At first I assumed it was a bear. Blackhollow is black bears, and I'd been warned to hang my food 100 yards from camp. Which I had. But bears don't walk like this. The footsteps were heavy. Heavier than anything I'd heard in the wild before. And slow, deliberate, each one pressing into the earth with a kind of controlled weight. Like something enormous trying very hard not to be heard, and failing anyway. I lay still. I didn't reach for the camera. I want to be honest about that. My first instinct was a documentation. It was survival. The footsteps circled the tent once. Then they stopped. Directly outside, close enough that I could hear breathing. Long, slow, deliberate breathing, nothing like a person's voice spoke. It was deep. Broken, almost like something unused to speech or unused to this particular language. It said, "You came alone. I didn't move. I don't think I breathed." Then, after a long pause, it spoke again. "Puh." And then, nothing. No footsteps leaving. No sound of it walking away. Just silence, total and absolute, for the rest of the night. I sat awake with my hand on my knife until the sky started to lighten. And only then did I let myself close my eyes. And only for a moment. At first light, I unzipped the tent and found the ground around my camp covered in prints. They circled the tent completely, a full loop, no gaps. They were enormous. Nearly 18 inches, human-like in shape, but with a heel and arch no human foot could produce. And a stride length between prints that suggested something walking upright on two legs at a size that should not have been physically possible. I photographed them. I measured them. I filmed them from every angle I could think of. Hands shaking the entire time. Telling myself this was still a documentary, this was still research. I was still in control of what was happening. Then I noticed something. The trail didn't just circle my tent and vanish into the trees. It led somewhere. Against every piece of survival training I'd ever half listened to. I packed my gear and followed it. I walked for almost 2 hours. The trail was easy to follow. Whatever made it wasn't trying to hide anymore. And it led me steadily uphill, away from the marked trails. Into a part of the forest that wasn't on any of my maps. Eventually the trees opened into a small clearing. And in that clearing stood a building. An old ranger station. Wood siding gone gray with age. A collapsed section of roof on the north side. Windows either broken or boarded from the inside. According to my map, no ranger station existed anywhere near these coordinates. The door was open. I should have called it in. I should have marked my GPS position and walked back the way I had came and told Dana we needed a bigger crew and better equipment before doing anything else. Instead, I stepped inside. The first thing I saw was my own backpack. The one I had left at my camp, the 2 hours walk away. Zipped exactly as I had packed it. It was sitting in the middle of the ranger station floor. My camera was inside it. A second camera I hadn't been carrying, untouched, battery full. I remember standing there for a long time. Doing the kind of math that doesn't work. 2 hours of hiking. A pack I hadn't carried. No trail connecting the two locations except the one I had just walked. Then I saw the wall. Something had written across it in what I told myself then and later was simply dirt and ash pressed into the wood in tall, uneven letters. Ask me. I want to tell you I left. I want to tell you that was the moment I turned around. I hiked back to my truck and drove until Blackhollow was a shrinking shape in my rearview mirror. I didn't. I've asked myself why almost every day since. The honest answer is that 12 years of documentary work had trained something into me. A reflex that says when something impossible happens in front of you, you point the camera at it. That reflex has served me my whole career. That day, it nearly cost me everything. I set up the second camera on a tripod, framing the center of the room. I found 2 chairs in a back office, both intact despite the building's decay, and placed them across from each other in the middle of the floor. One for me, one for whatever had led me here. Then I sat down, and I waited. Nothing happened for almost 3 hours. I want you to understand what 3 hours of silence in an abandoned building feels like when you know, with total certainty, that you are not alone in the forest around it. Every creak of settling wood became a footstep. Every gust of wind through the broken roof became breathing. At 2:14 p.m., the temperature in the room dropped hard enough that I could see my breath. Then I heard it behind me. Breathing. Long, slow, deliberate, the same breathing from outside my tent the night before. I turned around. He was standing in the doorway, and even having seen the footprints, even having heard the voice, nothing prepared me for the scale of him. He had to duck to clear the frame. His shoulders nearly spanned the doorway's width. His body was covered in dark, coarse hair, matted in places, and his face was the part that undid me. It was structured almost like a human face. The proportions were close enough to trigger some deep recognition in my brain. Some part of me that wanted to see a person standing there. But it wasn't a person. And his eyes told me that immediately. They weren't animal eyes, dull, reactive, present tense. They were old. Impossibly old. The kind of eyes that have watched things happen for longer than the concept of watching has existed. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the camera I was holding. I pointed it at him anyway, and I asked the first question of my life that I already knew I might not survive asking. Are you Bigfoot? He looked at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, something that might have been a smile moved across his face. That's what you call me. I sat back down across from him. He didn't move to the second chair. I don't think his frame would have fitted. But he lowered himself to the floor across from me. And somehow that made him seem less enormous, though not by much. I asked him how long his kind had lived in this forest. He looked toward the broken window for a long time before answering. Before your roads. A pause. Before your houses. Another pause. Lumber. Before you learned to be afraid of the dark. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, nothing about that room was funny. But because I was so afraid that laughter came out sideways. The way it does sometimes when your body doesn't know what else to do with the pressure building inside it. I asked him if there were more like him. His expression shifted. Something tightened in his face. And for the first time he looked directly into the lens of the camera rather than at me. You think I'm the one you should be afraid of? I stopped filming for a moment. My hand was still on the camera. But I lowered it slightly and asked him, off the record, what he meant. He didn't answer with words. He raised one enormous arm and pointed past me, toward the tree line visible through the open door, toward the deeper part of the forest that had no marked trails at. Oh, something else lies here. I sat with that for a moment before I kept going. I had a list of questions in my head. The kind I'd normally have written on an index card for any other interview subject, and I made myself ask them, one at a time. Because some part of me understood this might be the only chance anyone ever got to ask them. I asked him why he hid from humans. If he was as old and as powerful as he seemed to be. He considered that for a long time. Hiding is not the same as hiding from you. I didn't understand, and I told him so. He didn't explain further. I asked him if any human had ever seen him and lived to tell about it. Really seen him up close, the way I was seeing him now. Some. I asked how many. He held up one hand, fingers spread, and said nothing else. I asked him what happens to people who go past the second ridge. The line the old man in town had warned me about. For the first time, he looked almost sad. They stop being asked, they start being answered. I asked him what that meant, exactly what the difference was. He shook his head, slowly. And for a moment, I understood that this was one of the questions he simply wasn't going to answer. No matter how I phrased it. I asked him why he hadn't left this forest. If it was this dangerous. If he had lived through however many decades or centuries of whatever kept happening here. Because if I leave, no one stays who remembers what not to say. I asked what he meant by what not to say. He looked toward the tree line again. And his whole body seemed to tense. As if the question itself had weight. As if asking it too loudly might summon an answer neither of us wanted. Their name. I asked him carefully, my hand tightening around the camera. Why he couldn't say their name. He was quiet for almost a full minute. Long enough that I checked the battery indicator on my camera twice. Certain something had gone wrong with the recording, though it hadn't. Finally, he answered. Because saying it is how they know where to look. I asked him about Russell Voss, about Amy Castellano, about Elias Cho. I asked him if he had taken them. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked angry. His hands, each easily 3 times the size of mine, closed around the arm of the chair beside him. And I heard the wood groan, then crack, splinters falling to the floor. I almost ran. I want to be honest about that. Every part of my body was screaming at me to get up and get out the door while it was still open. But then he spoke, and something in his voice made me stay. You think I took them? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. It was exactly what I thought. What the police report implied without saying. What every missing persons documentary about a forest eventually circles back to. He leaned toward me. His face was close enough now that I could feel the difference in the air around him. Colder, heavier, he whispered. I tried to save him. I asked him what that meant. He turned his head toward the door, toward the dark tree line beyond it. And I watched something that looked unmistakably like fear pass across a face that, moments earlier, had splintered solid wood with one hand. They heard it calling. I asked, calling who? He looked back at me. And for the first time, I understood that the thing sitting across from me, 8 feet of muscle and hair and impossible age, was afraid of something else in these woods. He whispered a single word. Them. I asked him as calmly as I could manage what that meant. He didn't answer with words this time either. He stood and the entire room seemed to shrink around his frame. He walked toward the door, and just before reaching it, he stopped. Without turning back to face me, he said, "Turn off the camera." I asked him why. He repeated it, quieter, more urgent. "Turn it off." I didn't. I've replayed that decision more times than any other moment of my life. And I still don't fully understand why I made it. Some combination of stubbornness, professional instinct, and the simple, stupid belief that a camera recording something makes that something less able to hurt you. As if the lens were a kind of shield. It isn't. The camera kept rolling. Bigfoot turned around slowly, his entire body rigid. But he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at something behind me. The image on the camera began to shake. And for a moment I assumed it was my own hands. Until I realized the tripod itself was vibrating. Faintly, as if something heavy had begun moving somewhere beneath the floor. Or somewhere very close outside the walls. Then I heard it. Outside, in the trees. A sound that at first I mistook for wind through branches. Then it resolved into something unmistakable. Crying. A single voice, distant, weeping somewhere out past the tree line. Then another voice joined it, closer. Then another. Within a minute, I could count. I actually tried to count. Some part of my brain still clinging to the idea that I could document and quantify my way through this. At least a dozen distinct voices, weeping. From every direction around the ranger station. Bigfoot's voice, when he spoke again, had dropped to almost nothing. "They know you're here." I grabbed my camera and my pack and moved for the door. Every instinct I had left was screaming at me to run. To get back to my truck. To put miles of forest between myself and whatever was producing a dozen weeping voices from the tree line. Bigfoot moved to block the doorway before I reached it. I shouted at him. I told him to move, that I needed to leave. That whatever this was, I wasn't equipped for it. He didn't move. Then something struck the outside wall of the station. Hard. A full-body impact that shook dust from the rafters and cracked one of the remaining unbroken windows. Another impact followed from a different wall. I looked at Bigfoot and somehow, despite everything, I still asked the question a documentarian asks before the question a frightened human being asks. What is that? he answered without looking away from the door. The reason I stay hidden. The crying outside stopped all at once, as if a single switch had been thrown. The silence that followed was worse than any of the sound had been. Then, from somewhere in the trees, a small voice, a child's voice, called out a single word. Daddy? I want to be very precise here, because this is the part of the story that broke something in me, and I don't think will ever fully heal. That voice was my daughter's voice. Not similar to it. Not close to it. Exactly her voice, the specific cadence she uses, the specific way she draws out the second syllable of daddy when she's scared or wants attention. My daughter was, at that moment, 700 miles away, asleep in her bed, under the supervision of her mother, entirely safe. And her voice was calling to me from a forest that had already taken 3 people. Bigfoot's hand impossibly gently closed over my shoulder. He looked directly into my eyes, and for the only time in our entire encounter, I felt something from him that resembled concern for me specifically, rather than fear of what was outside. Don't answer. The voice came again, closer this time. Daddy, please. Every part of me wanted to answer. I felt the word rising in my throat before I could stop it. Bigfoot's hand moved from my shoulder to cover my mouth, firm enough that I couldn't have spoken even if I'd lost the battle with myself. Outside, something began scratching at the door. Slow. Deliberate. One long scratch. The sound of something dragging a single point across old wood. Then another. Then silence again. When the scratching stopped, Bigfoot lowered his hand from my mouth and stepped back. And something in the room's pressure seemed to ease slightly, though not fully. I asked him, my voice barely working, why he had brought me here. Why leave the note? Why let me see him at all, when clearly it had cost him something to do it? He looked exhausted in a way I didn't know a creature like him could look. Because people still come. I asked, come here for what? To find me. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, if laughter could carry no humor in it at all. They bring cameras, guns, traps. His expression darkened and may disappear. I asked if he was trying to warn people. If that was the point of all this. The tracks, the note, the interview. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since he'd arrived. Something in his posture changed. Not fear, not anger. Something closer to exhaustion carried for a very long time. I have tried before. I asked him what he meant. He told me, in pieces, about a hiker 11 years earlier who he'd followed for 2 days, staying just visible at the tree line, trying to turn him back toward the trailhead without frightening him into running. Deeper in, the hiker had filed a report about a shy Sasquatch sighting that made regional news for a week and was forgotten within a month. He never went near this forest again. But Bigfoot said that was the only success he could count. Out of dozens of attempts, and it had happened by accident. He told me about leaving trails of broken branches, deliberately, in patterns meant to look like warnings rather than random damage. Mistaken, every time, for bear activity or stone debris. He told me about a woman, years before Elias Cho, who he'd shown himself to directly, fully, the way he was showing himself to me now. Hoping the shock alone would be enough to send her running back toward safety. She hadn't run. She'd raised the camera, the same way I had, and asked him to hold still for a photograph. He told me she disappeared 4 days later. I stopped showing myself after her for a long time. I asked him why he'd chosen to show himself to me. Then, after everything, he looked at the note still visible on the wall behind me. Ask me, pressed into the wooden dirt and ash, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, because you already had the camera pointed at the truth, I only had to open the door. I asked him if he thought this would work. If people would listen this time. Watching this instead of a blurry photograph in a newspaper. He looked directly into the lens. But nobody listens to monsters. Outside, the scratching started again, but this time from a different location. Not the door. The wall directly behind me. Bigfoot's entire body went rigid. The fear I'd seen flicker across his face earlier returned. Fully, and this time it didn't leave. It's inside. I turned toward the door. It was still closed. Still, as far as I could see, undisturbed. Then I heard breathing. Not from outside. From behind me. Inside the room. I spun the camera around toward the sound. The room, as far as the lens could show me, was empty. But Bigfoot wasn't looking at the empty space where I was pointing the camera. He was staring at the corner of the room, the darkest corner, with a collapsed section of roof let almost no light through. Something in that corner moved. I don't have adequate words for what I saw in the half-second before the camera fell from my hands. I've tried, in the weeks since, to describe it to the 2 people I've told this story to, and in both times I've failed. The closest I can come is this: it was tall. Taller than Bigfoot. Impossibly thin, in a way that didn't match how it moved. In a way that suggested the thinness was a kind of truce rather than a physical limitation. And it had no features I could identify as a face. Only a suggestion of one. The way a shadow suggests the shape of the object, casting it without ever quite becoming that object. The camera hit the floor and kept recording, lens angled sideways, capturing nothing but the base of the wall and my own boots. For the next several seconds, according to the timestamp when I later reviewed the footage, there was only darkness and sound. I heard myself screaming. I don't remember screaming. I remember only silence in my own head, a kind of white out. And then finding myself outside the ranger station, running, with no memory of how I got through the door. I heard something enormous moving behind me. Not chasing, I don't think, but moving fast. In the opposite direction, as if it too were fleeing something. Then, silence. When I finally stopped running, nearly a mile from the station, and forced myself to pick the shaking camera back up off the ground, where I'd apparently dropped it a second time without remembering, and rewound the footage with hands that could barely operate the controls. Bigfoot was gone from the frame. The chair across from where I'd been sitting was empty. One arm still cracked and splintered from where his hand had gripped it. The door of the ranger station, visible at the edge of the frame, stood open. And outside, spreading out from the building in every direction, the footage showed hundreds of footprints in the disturbed earth. Not Bigfoot's prints. Human prints. Ordinary, human-sized, human-shaped footprints, hundreds of them, overlapping, crossing over each other, radiating outward from the ranger station into the deeper forest. But there was one detail in that footage that I have never been able to explain, and I think about every single day. Every one of those footprints faced the same direction, into the forest. Not one, not a single print, out of what a forensic consultant I later spoke with estimated at over 300 distinct impressions, traced back toward the station. No one had ever walked back out. I don't remember most of the hike back to my truck. I remember arriving at it in full daylight, though my last clear memory placed the sun already low. I remember driving to Millbrook Junction and pulling into the gas station and sitting in the driver's seat for what the clerk later told me was almost 40 minutes before I came inside and asked to use their phone. I called the county sheriff's office. I told them everything. The tracks, the ranger station, the voices, the interview, all of it, in a jumbled, breathless rush that I'm sure sounded exactly like what it was a man. In shock, 2 deputies drove out with me the next morning to find the ranger station. We found the coordinates, we found the clearing. We did not find the building. I want to be careful here, because I've heard every alternative explanation offered to me since that I got turned around. That exhaustion and dehydration had produced a kind of waking hallucination. That Blackhallow's dense canopy makes GPS unreliable, and I simply logged the wrong location. I don't believe any of those explanations, but I also can't disprove them because there was genuinely nothing there. No foundation, no collapsed roof, no scattered wood from a shattered chair arm. Just undisturbed forest floor, in a clearing that looked as though nothing had stood on it in decades, if ever. The footage from my second camera, the one I'd set up on the tripod, was gone. Not corrupted, not blank. Gone, as if the card had never held any data at all. Though I had personally checked the file directory the morning before I hiked. The only footage that survived was from the camera I'd been holding. Fragmented, shaking, much of it aimed at the ground or the ceiling rather than at Bigfoot directly, but enough of it, I believed, to prove something had happened. I gave that footage to the sheriff's department. I gave a full statement. They thanked me for my cooperation. They told me, gently, that stress and prolonged solo time in unfamiliar wilderness can produce experiences that feel completely real to the person experiencing them. I understood, reading between the lines, exactly what they meant. They thought I had gotten lost, panicked, and built an elaborate story to explain hours I couldn't otherwise account for. For a while, I'm ashamed to admit this, I started to believe them too. It was easier than the alternative. It let me sleep some nights. It let me hold my daughter without flinching at the sound of her voice. Then, 3 weeks later, the envelope arrived. It had no return address, no postmark I could clearly read. The ink was smudged, as though it had gotten wet and dried again before reaching me. Inside was a single photograph, It should be interior of the ranger station. Me, sitting in the chair I remembered sitting in. Bigfoot, across from me, mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open, one hand resting on the arm of his chair before it had cracked. The angle was wrong. It wasn't the angle of either of my cameras. It was taken from somewhere behind me and slightly to the left, from a position no tripod I own had occupied, from a height that would have required whatever took it to be standing, not sitting, not mounted on any surface in that room. And in the far corner of the frame, in the same dark corner where I had seen movement just before then, camera fell. There was a third figure. Tall, thin, in that same unnatural, deliberate way. Completely black, without features, without texture. As if someone had cut a person-shaped hole directly out of the photograph. And the darkness of the room behind it had simply been allowed to show through. I turned the photograph over with hands that had gone completely numb. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, pressed hard enough into the paper that I could feel the letters with my fingertip, was a single line. The interview was never about Bigfoot. And beneath it, smaller, almost an afterthought, it wanted to meet you too. I haven't gone back to Blackhollow. I never will. I've turned down 2 other assignments that would have taken me anywhere near a national forest, and I've told my producer, without much explanation, that I'm done with wilderness documentaries entirely. I kept the photograph. I don't know why. Some nights I think about burning it. I've never been able to make myself do it. The footage, what survives of it, is the only thing I've allowed myself to show anyone. And even then, only in short, fragmented clips. Never the full sequence. Because I don't fully trust what happens to people who watch all of it in one sitting. That might sound dramatic. I don't care anymore whether it sounds dramatic. I care about being honest about what happened to me. Because nobody else is going to tell the story. And I meant what Bigfoot said, in that room. More than I think even he understood at the time. Nobody listens to monsters. But I'm not a monster. I'm just a man with a camera who followed tracks he shouldn't have followed. Into a building that officially does not exist. To interview something that spent our entire conversation more afraid of its own neighbors than it was of me. Some nights, usually late, usually when the house is otherwise silent, I hear something outside. Heavy footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling the walls the way they circled my tent that first night in Blackhollow. And every single time, I ask myself the same question. And I have never once managed to answer it. Was Bigfoot warning me? Or was he introducing me? If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a forest that swallows people without explanation, without struggle, without ever giving them back, don't go looking for what did it. Because somewhere in the dark, past the second ridge, past the place where the trail markers stop, something might already be listening for your name. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events, places, or persons is purely coincidental and intended for entertainment purposes only. If you made it this far, subscribe, because next time, it might not be a forest telling the story.